All right, we are live. It takes a few minutes, well, a few seconds to notify everyone that we're live. So we'll just give it a few seconds. And while that notification is happening, I want to say hello to everyone who is watching the recording as well. We recognize that everyone isn't going to be able to watch it live. So for those that are watching the recording, welcome and thank you. My name is Andrea Henderson. For those of you who don't know me, I'm here with Kim Crowder, who is the CEO of Courageous Sprout. We're here to talk about um, three pivots senior leaders must to transform crisis into strategic advantage. I'm so excited to have this conversation. It got a lot of reaction. There's a lot of interest in the topic, and I think it's very timely. So we are going to get started. So, Kim, when organizational crisis hits, C suite, VPs, executive leadership face unique pressures on tactical management. We've seen so many examples of that recently, and I feel like the cycles are coming much more frequently. Um, why do organizations with strong metrics still collapse during crisis while others, even with fewer resources, remain resilient?
Yeah, a couple things. I want to back up a little bit, if that's okay, and talk about what
Okay.
constitutes a crisis, because I think that's an important topic of conversation. And because crisis can show up in many different ways in organizations, whether they're coming from an external issue, whether it's a global issue, whether it's
Yeah.
coming from inside the organization or a misstep. And so I want to talk about it at that level, because when we talk about organizations who have strong metrics versus organizations who are smaller, who may stay more resilient, sometimes it does depend on where the crisis is coming from. Right? Whether
Mhm.
that, what the
Okay.
baseline for that crisis is. And so I want to, sort of lay that out. And what a crisis basically is an unplanned, unexpected event that has major impact on the organizational operations as they are known, as they are, right? And so that can come in many
Mhm.
different ways, whether it comes from a position of how it impacts your stakeholders, like it could be any of your audiences, including your team members, including your leadership team, including your customers across the board. So, and your board members. So that's setting up that baseline. When we talk about why some organizations may have more success, I would say, right, during a crisis moment, it's for several different reasons. The first one of the first reasons is organizations, when we've worked with organizations, is deciding whether or not this is a problem to solve. Is this something we need to solve? Is this something we need to focus on? And here's what I mean by that.
Mm.
Sometimes organizations are walking into a crisis and may not recognize it, even though team members are raising their hand and saying, hey, we think something's not quite right here, or customers are starting to show up different in their behavior. That's a key way to determine whether or not, of course, you see it in your P&L, of course, but you start to see it before it even hits P&L. You often see it in the behavior of your stakeholders. And so whether or not organizations
Yeah.
decide,
P&L
is that a
is
problem, then determines whether or not they're going to be successful in the long run. And so what we know is that organizations that are smaller typically feel that impact sooner and typically recognize that impact
mm,
sooner, so that they're able to make pivots more quickly. When we're dealing with more complex organizations, that can be more tricky, right? How long does that communications tree
yeah.
take? How is this happening in one area or in one region, and what's the impact across the board? And so that's where we see a lot of determining whether or not there's going to be success or not, as a big one. Again, as far as whether at what point organizations decide we're headed to crisis, beforehand?
Yeah, that's a great point. And P&L is a lagging indicator, right? So,
It is.
you looking at your P&L monthly or quarterly, so that's after the fact. So it is important to kind of figure out, do you have mechanisms in place to kind of um, see the crisis while it's evolving?
And
That is a great point. And small organizations typically
can I pull in
can
something
do what?
on that? We are watching that happen.
Absolutely.
I'm not going to name an organization, but we're watching this happen for an organization who has been in the news for several months, where they started to see the foot traffic and the way that people talked about them online change first. And months
Yeah.
later, right now, we're seeing it in their stockholders, like in the way that they're showing up in the stock market. We're seeing it as far
Yes.
as revenue is considered. Now that's where we're seeing it. And it is an after effect, as you just mentioned, that it is a lagging indicator. We first saw it in foot traffic.
Yes.
That was the first indicator. And well, we first saw it in how people were talking about them on social media. Then we saw it in foot traffic. And then
Social listening.
yes. And then months later, we saw it, now we're seeing it in the actual revenue at a tremendous level, as well as all of those things that existed before.
Absolutely. And I'm confident I know which organization you're talking about. So that is a great example. Um, you know what, and at the risk of, you know, calling organizations out, but they're widely discussed. We've seen an organization like Boeing, right, recently have a crisis, and the CEO has been on CNBC talking about the fact that they had a crisis, and what I found interesting is that he attributed that crisis in large part to culture, right? So they had planes that were panels blowing off, parts of the plane blowing off mid-flight, and other malfunctions. And he attributed that crisis to a culture, not having a culture of quality.
Mm.
And I thought that was an interesting example. And so I think that evolved over multiple years, quite frankly. And Boeing is a huge organization, traditional organization. And so that is another example of a large organization that um, maybe was a little bit slow to react.
I love that you mentioned that as an example. It wasn't the organization I was talking about previously. However, yes,
No, different.
it is an organization that is seeing impacts. I've even made travel decisions based on it, to be frank, around that, right? But my Lean Six Sigma mind, right, thinks about this in where you talk about it's a culture of quality. I can bet you that if there's some backtracking that's done, you can backtrack where that happened in the process and then how team members responded to it. Does that make sense? So we're still looking at where there was a behavioral shift, but it wasn't taken into account as important enough. So here's what I want to talk about real quick is what I love is that in working with our clients, I'm thinking about a client in particular who has been hit by a tremendous loss of funding right now at a major institution. And I think about how they were talking about this before it happened and how they were bringing their team members into a conversation before it happened. And so that now, while they're in the midst of the storm, there is continuous conversation that's happening, even though there's a lot of uncertainty, the trust level already exists. And so while, the truth of the matter is that unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't make those crisis plans until they need it. It's just like, when somebody says it's time to work out and then you go and you see your cholesterol and you go, oh, okay. Now it's expensive enough. that I feel like I have to do something about it. But we are seeing organizations who are building cultures that preempt crisis so that in the midst of crisis, they can be as successful. And this is a smaller organization. Well, it's a smaller team within a larger organization, smaller leadership team. So it's actually not a small organization, but they themselves have created such a resilient environment that they are able to move forward in ways that the larger organization is not.
So I'm just really feeling very provocative today, and we haven't discussed this before for anyone watching. So feel free to tap out and say, you know what, I don't want to touch that. But there's another organization and another crisis that I'm thinking of, which was very public, but they dealt with it because they had to in real time. And that was Southwest Airlines, December 2022, when they had a holiday meltdown. There was over 16,000 flights canceled during peak holiday travel because of scheduling issues with the crew. And so in my list of examples, that came up in the wasn't handled well column, and we watched it evolve like Boeing, which we watched evolve over several years. That one we watched evolve real time, over a condensed period of, several days over the holidays. Um, any thoughts about,
Excuse me.
not necessarily bad question specifically, but the fact that we watched that evolve in real time. As a consultant that works with clients on those issues, were you sitting there thinking, oh, I have some ideas for them, or I see what's happening?
Give me your just so I understand your question about if we were 2 years ago or now.
No, I'm thinking as you're watching it real time, because it's kind of
Mhm.
unfair to dissect. I mean, no, it's not. That's necessarily unfair. But I mean, as you're watching it real time, because we're watching the massive delays and the ripple effects and the CEO saying, uh, it's weather, but also really slow to say anything.
Mhm.
So, I know in that period, the company lost about $800 million over that holiday
Mhm.
period, which was supposed to be a very profitable period. And I would say an erosion of public trust at that point, which for a brand that was really highly regarded. Now, I'm not saying that they haven't regained the public trust, but it was a ding for
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah,
Do you remember
I do remember.
experiencing that?
I do. I do remember that. When I think about challenges such as those, there's the hard part is that I'm not on the inside, right? So I don't know where the process didn't quite work. But here's what I will say is that when we look at organizations, because this happened in two ways, they had an internal crisis and an external crisis. Sometimes it doesn't happen concurrently, but it did. And the impact also impacted a partner, which was the airport. Right. So I want us to think about it that way when we look at the ripple effects of a crisis. This is an internal crisis. This is a partner crisis. This is now a stakeholder in our customers' crisis. It's big. And so when I look back at what advice I would have given them then, I imagine that rarely do your team members not tell you what's about to happen. Rarely do your team members who are closer to those challenges give some indication about what could happen. Rarely. The challenge is that it's a few things, is whether or not that information can get up into the C-suite. I don't know.
Yeah.
Whether or not that information, whether they know it is, whether they're comfortable sharing that, has upper level leadership created an environment where team members, when they see areas of risk, that they can speak to mitigate that risk, even if it is in some way anonymous, to say, hey, here's where we're headed. But I imagine that those team members, especially those boots on the ground team members who tend to be really brilliant in understanding the impact on customers and daily operations, whether or not they had a voice to be able to share that this was headed in that direction. And usually what we find is that if those team members are not brought into those conversations, they're often complaining on the floor, sometimes with each other, sometimes with customers. Customers are complaining back, and they have all of this untapped data that could give the answer to here's what's happening, right? We saw this in a client that we work with, where we did an external look with we've done this a few times actually. And I'm just thinking about this one where we had an external look at working with their customers. We did a customer assessment. We also did an internal team assessment. And when we put those side by side, what we found is that they were in direct opposition of each other. The very values that this organization said that they had, their customers did not hold those same values at all.
Very interesting.
And so the impact was the organization was unable to expand and move forward in a lot of ways that they would have liked to, because they were afraid of losing the customers, because they had not listened to their team members and their customers earlier in their process. And so as their client, their sort of partners, they were doing advertising and that sort of thing, as their partners were shifting focus and changing, more in a crisis going, we don't know where we're headed to next. It's sort of like the Blockbuster and the Kodak effect, right? Where they're missing what's happening in the market, and then being, having to sort of stall out unless they made radical change, which they were afraid to do because that would have impacted, their profits immediately. And so what I'm getting at here is ways that you bring in your team member voices and let those voices hit your C-suite. That stuff is golden. And I think too many organizations miss out on that. Often the communication goes here and down instead of having the ability for that communication to go up.
Yeah, you're so right. I think it's an org design issue. It's a culture issue.
It's a leadership issue. It is a leadership issue.
Spot on.
Because culture design, all of that is
a leadership issue.
Directly tied to upper level leadership.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It reminds me, that example, or rather this Southwest Airlines example also reminds me of something that happens often in hospitals with scheduling. There are often crises around staffing levels that are unsafe. And being able to say, we can't run like this. And if something happens because of unsafe staffing levels, then people want to, point fingers, find someone to blame. But the reality is that this is something that could have been predicted because it's a known issue. All right. So let's talk about now highlighting some of this for the board. How do successful executive teams align with the board during a crisis? And some unsuccessful, the opposite, fail to align with the board and experience significant disconnects.
Yeah, I love this question actually, because
I want successful teams align.
Say that again for me.
Oh, I was just repeating the first part of the question. How does successful teams align with.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I love this question. I'm going to tell you why I love this question. Because some of this is, well, I am anybody here anybody here taking Kolbe? Like, is anybody, if you have it in the chat, just says, yes, I've taken Kolbe. And one of my strengths in Kolbe is I'm a fact finder, and which means I like information. I love information. And I love to dig into information. I have to know when to stop. You go, okay, I've done enough. But here's why I say that is because oftentimes, maybe I shouldn't say oftentimes, one of the ways that we've coached clients to be most powerful in getting board support is to educate the board early. Educate the board as much as you can. And what I mean by that is educate the board on what happens if we handle this well, and what happens if we don't handle it well. What does that look like? What does that look like financially? What does that look like on the impact with our external audiences? Break that down into the different ways that it shows up. Because then what happens is when you are aligning your board, you have something to point to immediately. And let's say you're in the midst of a crisis, bring that to the board early. Hey, here's where we are. Even if it's 3 points, like 3 different points for those different audiences, it doesn't have to be long. It needs to be quick for something that your board can align with, and get your board on board, right? To understand the impact and why it's so crucial that they are aligned with you now. Also, I would say, talk about crisis early with your board members and your expectations as from the board level about where they sit in a time of crisis. The hard part is that sometimes board members don't know where they sit. Like, what's the expectation? Most board members feel like, we want to help. How can we help? And oftentimes board members need guidance. The hardest time to educate is in the middle of it. That is the hardest time to educate. And so one of the things we do is we work with our clients to build that into the continuous language that you have with the board, so that the board understands, okay, we're here, we pretty much know where to go. And you have your board president who can lead that because they're educated on what that looks like. So that's one less area that the C-suite has to lean so heavily on, right? They don't have to get that buy-in. That buy-in exists, and they can focus on the other areas that they need to focus on to take some of that pressure off. And so where I see that mistake happens is not creating the link so that the board members truly understand impact early, and then expecting your board just to come along when your board may have a lot of questions in that moment if that channel of communication hasn't been opened earlier.
So let me tap in on that part. I've seen boards have structured tabletop exercises where they will go through a scenario responding to a cybersecurity attack, or they will respond to. I've most often seen it with cybersecurity, or they may role play a response to, let's say, an activist investor scenario. But there are so many others,
So many
crises, right? Where it isn't typically role played through a tabletop exercise, and then potentially you could have a scenario where the leadership team or the board freezes because they don't know how to react. I know we are going to talk about how later, in a more intimate setting, for senior leaders in May. And I want to talk about that a little bit later. But it's interesting to think about the fact that there are certain crises that boards and leadership teams plan for. And then there are others where they don't plan for them, where they're completely freeze and don't know how to respond.
Yeah.
Do you see that? And it is without going into too much about that, is a tabletop exercise a potential solution?
It's just like running a fire drill. I think there's nothing wrong with those. I do think there are some baseline things that need to be in place that work no matter what type of crisis it is. And that can happen, right? Because you can't necessarily always predict what the crisis will be, but you can have baseline steps in place so that people understand what forward movement looks like, right? And you are right. It's interesting because we had this conversation, and I know we had this conversation in a previous forum that we had for executives where we talk about these challenges. We hold them monthly, and we're actually holding an encore presentation in partnership together because this topic, the crisis leadership topic, is so important. And in that first one of the insights that we talked about was how leaders show up during crisis, how board members show up during crisis. You don't always know that upfront. But I think broaching that and saying, hey, just, here's what we know is that in crisis, here's some of the ways, and it's that, fight or flight, freeze, fawn. Those are it, right? It's that natural human instinct as far as how trauma shows up in the way that people make decision making. We just expect every executive and every board member to be able to have rapid decision making in those moments when in fact that's not real life. And so what I believe is most powerful is to talk about in real life what could be the things that could be a barrier to forward movement, and then how do we tackle those. Those are questions that you can ask board members. The last, to say the last time, what was the last crisis you went through, laying some things out and walking through some of that. Everybody won't always have a clear picture of themselves around how they handle things, and that's just normal. But you can at least start to have conversations around that. Again, the hard part is I'm talking about this preemptively, right? When sometimes it just happens during, and it could be based on other circumstances. So then your organization needs to think about, your executive leaders need to think about, how do we fill in that gap? What's the bridge if we find that is happening? If we find a leader who can only be tunnel vision focused in this, what skill sets do we need from the other team members? Yes, and I agree, Jay, that's very much true, that there are small crises, absolutely. What do we need to be thinking about in order to move those leaders forward? And also in order to bridge that gap in the meantime. And speaking about what Jay is talking about, that, those smaller crises that happen, those happen on a regular basis, whether you're having dissension and conflict with in the C-suite, because that absolutely happens, even though that's not always seen as a large crisis, it does happen. And so it is giving problem-solving skill sets wherever we need it, and not assuming that your executives have those in every way just because they're in the C-suite. We see a lot of the need for education around rapid decision-making, around the ability to be able to change your behavior in certain moments of pressure. And we just expect executives have that and board members have that, when that's always not the case.
Yeah. One of the things that I want to highlight is that we are talking broad stroke about the topics, the pain points, the challenge. One of the reasons why we're talking about the what, one of the reasons we're not talking about the how is because it's a conversation that has to happen in a very intimate setting, because we talk about details, we talk about trauma responses, we talk about specific situations where um, responded well, and somewhere they haven't responded well, and you can't do that in a forum like this. It has to be in a more intimate setting. So I know, for example, if there's a fire, my automatic response is stop, drop, and roll. That's how I was trained. Somebody else might be trained to respond to another crisis, and we can share that information. someone else may have lived experience. They have lived through a crisis and they can share from their experience, but that is also can be very, very emotional. And it requires an intimate setting. So I'm just saying that to say the reason why we are co collaborating on this intimate conversation in May is so that we can go in more detail, so that there's some confidentiality, so that we can dig a little deeper than we can dig on this forum. Did you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I sure would love to. We have what you're talking about is the Courageous Crowd executive conversations. Again, we host those monthly, and we have one coming up. I want to say it's May 7th. I dropped Andrea, the link is down in your chat because I can't drop it in the whole. I can't drop it largely, but it's for VPs Plus who want to talk about these things in a safe environment. And what I love about these conversations is, as you mentioned, people can be detailed, people can be specific, but also they can hear what's happening across organizations, across industries. And so we love to bring, at this invite only level, right, folks into that space where we've done a lot of vetting to see who's coming in, to make sure that everyone can not only share their insights, but learn some insights. We'll be sharing some things as well for leaders to take away, because our goal is that leaders can immediately use something. Right now, what we're hearing around crisis has a lot to do with AI adoption. It has a lot to do with what's happening, possibly with tariffs or any other funding. We're finding that very brilliant people are looking for roles and they can't find those jobs. And so the impact on that is organizations are having a hard time deciding who to bring into those roles. And so it's happening in many different ways. And so we are opening the door for leaders to sort of take those jackets off a little bit and just be really honest. And then we take those insights and share them out with other VP pluses. It's great for networking, but it also is great for problem solving in an environment where you don't feel judged, where you don't feel like you have to know everything, and you can learn from other people openly.
You know what? There's some great comments, and I want to pivot. So Ted Bell says, when we talk about crisis, DEI is being threatened. You think it can survive? Will a strategic, adaptable, and data-informed approach be enough?
That's a great question.
I have some thoughts.
Here's what I say. Anything can survive that is willing to adapt. And here's what I mean by that. You can call it whatever you like. It's really hard to put the toothpaste back into the what in the tube. Right? Or after 2020 in particular, and I assume we'll talk about this, and when we talk about the ways that people handle crisis, or the way that people handle stressful or high impact topics in the workplace has changed tremendously since 2020. And the expectations have not changed about team members, about people, and where they want organizations to go. Ted, I actually I will bring in a name of somebody in the news right now, but we think about Target, right? And so is there proof based on what Target is experiencing that DEI is going anywhere, no matter what you call it, but around the expectation of the organization's customers and team members? I imagine they felt that internally too. We just don't know. And so that's the question is, who decides whether or not it's going anywhere? And so based on that, while it may take on another name, another shape, another form, I don't believe that it is going anywhere in the decided actions of people who are involved. Maybe the language has switched. Right? But we're seeing organizations double down. Marriott just doubled down. The CEO of Marriott just doubled down. Costco has doubled down. So again, we're seeing where organizations are really deciding what they're going to be moving into the future, but also you're seeing customers who are putting pressure on organizations to stay true to who they said they are. So your question, again, back to your question about, do I think it can survive? It has to. I exist, right? In some way, it has to, that, I exist. We're here. Will strategic, adaptable, and data-informed approaches be enough? I don't have the full answer to that yet, honestly. What I do have the answer to is how collectively people decide to respond when they're not seeing their values shown up in the businesses that they pay for.
So I want to double tap on that, Kim, and just say, from a healthcare perspective, healthcare is moving more towards personalized medicine. The fact that I am a woman, the fact that I'm a Black woman, is never going to change, regardless of what policy happens at the federal level. So as you develop personalized medicines, you're going to have to think about things like race and gender. When you're treating someone, you're going to have to think about behavior and sexual orientation and gender identity and all of that stuff. When you're thinking about creating medicines and managing risks around those medicines and therapies, um, regardless of what the policy is or the flavor of the day is, what is appropriate for me is not going to be the same as what is appropriate for me. So, like you said, you can call it what you want to call it, but the companies that are developing medicines understand that. The companies that are releasing movies understand that Sinners, I think they had a really great opening
number
weekend.
one in the box
There's a
office.
market out there. There's a market out. There's a market out there for that, and they're not going to leave that market untapped. You might not call it anything with those three letters, but their capitalism is not going to let that market go unserved.
Yeah, and Sydney just brought up something about Title VII, that's understanding the law and what the law includes when we start to talk about the civil rights movement in particular and all of the people or groups that it impacted. It's a broader conversation, certainly, but I leave with what I said as far as 46 million, Valerie, thank you, as far as what Sinners made this weekend. But I leave with what I said, in that no matter what you want to call it, at the end of the day, the toothpaste is out of the tube, and that's what it is. And so the expectations of the audiences and professionals and that sort of thing is there. And the assumption that even some people who hold higher positions or more power don't agree with that, I think is incorrect.
Yeah. So I also want to highlight the fact that a few minutes back, Jay mentioned that it's not just about addressing barriers, but about building capabilities to become future ready. And what the future looks like, because the demographics of this country and of the world are changing and shifting. Again, like you said, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. The demographics are changing, and consumers and buying power and wealth is being redistributed. And so the strategies that we use to address that have to evolve as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I would also say about, where we're moving is who's coming into the work environment. We're seeing younger people. We think about, a lot of companies are talking about succession planning right now. They're talking about skills gaps. I know many executives who are concerned about that. And so the truth of the matter is that there's a lot, we're in an interesting time in the world right now where what is important has sort of exploded. And organizations, especially executives, are having to come to grips with what that means and what is that going to look like for the future. Jay talked about future planning and what does that look like, continuous learning and development, and how that is essential. It absolutely is. And one of those things that is going to be essential is thinking about succession planning, who moves into those roles, and how do organizations start setting themselves up for success now so that they don't exit the market by not including the ideas and the skill sets and the talents necessary in order to make sure they're relevant for years to come.
I would argue that is a crisis. It is slow, but it is a crisis. It is the example of, and I'm sure it's a story that you've all heard. If you have a pot of boiling water and a frog jumps in it, he's going to jump right out because it's hot and he knows he will die. But if you have a pot of lukewarm water and the frog is sitting in it and you turn up the temperature and it starts to boil while he's sitting in it, he will stay in the water and die because he doesn't realize that the temperature is being turned up. And that talent crisis is like the frog in the lukewarm water with the temperature turning up until it boils. It is a crisis that is slow brewing that will destroy us if you don't do something about it. Because it's coming. It's a problem and it's coming.
Agreed. I'm like, agreed. I completely agree. Can I, if you don't mind, can I go ahead? I'm sorry. Yeah, I was gonna.
I don't mind.
Yeah, I was gonna say that, and I'm excited about us talking about this in a more intimate setting. We talked about that already. The virtual executive conversations that we're having. All of these can be those topics, whatever VPs Plus are concerned about, bringing those to the table and getting real-time solutions from other leaders like yourself, which is why we host these. They're complimentary. You don't pay a thing for them. They're 50 minutes. You pop in, you share, you learn, and then you head out. And we do that month over month. I'm really excited about talking more about crisis leadership and the ways that this shows up, as Jay said, the big C's and the little C's. Because really the truth of the matter is that the big C's are just magnified based on the little C's that happen leading up to that. Right. And unfortunately, sometimes people can react to the big C's, and we see organizations do a very beautiful job that we've worked with where we help them manage the little C's so that when the big C's come, they're not devastating. Because really, that's the point, right? You can't stop that train from coming, but it can certainly be less devastating based on what you've already built. And for so many executives right now, I know that just having those plans in place could really lower just their blood pressure, increase trust, right? Especially across the board on their team members, and really bringing their team members along. Because that C-suite has to be aligned and also has to be proactive instead of reactive. That's another thing that we've heard and that we'll talk about further. Somebody's watching from the UK. I absolutely love that. By all means, join us in the UK. It's set at a time that you can still come. So plan on coming to the Courageous Crowd, the upcoming Courageous Crowd virtual conversations. The link is in the chat. I'm sure Andrea will drop that again at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, I can drop it again now, and I can follow up individually afterwards. One of the things that I'm really interested in is, as we think about how we help organizations and leaders in the organizations deal with crisis better. And we also have to think about how we show up as individuals, right? So I also want to know, how would a woman who would tend to show up in a certain way deal with a crisis maybe differently than a man, maybe? What are some of the potential derailers or risks that I need to watch out for as a woman that maybe someone else would not? And then what does that look like for a Black woman in particular? Are there additional watch outs?
Yeah.
Any thoughts about that?
So I want to pull in something that I want to pull in another comment from the chat, because it's funny, you were saying this, and then also Jay was typing something in the chat at the same time. So bottom line, collaboration and diversity of thinking is essential for future readiness. How else do you navigate and thrive in the face of ever-present turbulence and uncertainty? And one of the things that you're saying is, how do you navigate those spaces when your identity may be different than other people in those spaces? And here's two things I want to say, because I want to like marry these. One, your identity often helps determine your ability to see things differently, right? Just because by nature of your experience, what I like to say is that we build our the ways that we learn, the ways that we interact with things based on how the world experiences us. So it's not always right that that everybody's on a same playing field because we're all in the same position, or that everyone. I don't want to assume that people don't think differently or show up differently because they all look the same. But I do know that how the world experiences you gives you different tools. When you talk about women, there are statistics and data around the ways that women handle crisis. You think about COVID, right? And you think about countries who had women leaders that fared better than countries that didn't. I'm not saying this in a way to compare. I am saying that the ways that women and men may see things, the ways that people of different backgrounds, whether that be from race or religion or geographically where they grew up, we all show up in different ways, in ways that can be really helpful in conversations where people value that difference. And it allows space for there to be no stone left unturned in ways that you may miss because you don't have those experiences. I'll give you another example. We recently we were coaching a partner through crisis right now, and they were talking about what they were going to say to team members. And we had just done a workshop with their team members. And I stopped them and said, your team is not going to go for this. The way that you want to communicate is it's that old school way of saying, hey, remember we got through all of these past years of this. Hey, remember, we got through that, we got through this. And I was like, your team members, based on what they shared as their concerns, some of that attached to their identities they're not going to go for what you're saying. And you're going to have to think about new ways to empower your team members. And some of that may mean some anonymous feedback around themes, right? We gave them some clear ways that they could focus. But what we knew was that what your team members are bringing back to you is data that you can use as a leader in order to better make decisions around how you communicate, but also around your decision making if you're willing to hear it. And so that's one of the things when we think about how do you navigate and thrive in the face of ever-present turbulence and uncertainty. And answering that question, one of the big ways, as Jay mentioned, is essential for collaboration. It is essential for allowing those voices to be heard. And again, having those channels that can do this and this. Because your team members will clue you into things all the time. And so that's to me, one of the biggest ways that this can be extremely powerful is that organizations are data gathering and allowing their team members to be a part of that data gathering and actually using the information that they're learning.
Yes, this was a great conversation. I feel like we could talk for another hour about this because it's such a big topic. But I do want to be respectful of everyone's time, and Kim, you have been such a resource for everyone that joined, and Nicola and Jay and Ted. Thank you for joining, and for everyone that watches in the future, the replay, thank you. We would love to hear your thoughts. Please drop them because we can come back and see them. Please send us a message if you'd like to join us for a more intimate conversation in May. And just stay connected because, like Kim said, she's going to continue to have monthly conversations, and I will have other conversations here on LinkedIn Live. So just stay connected. Thank you for joining, and we will see you another time. Have a great rest of your day and great rest of your week.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for your great questions. Thank you, Andrea, for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure.